Hey you guys, welcome back to another one of my videos. If you're new here, my name is Holly and thank you so much for watching. Before we get started, I want to show you guys my little earrings. These are little wine glasses and just how cute are they? Oh my gosh, very on trend for me. They're from my friend's little business, the Aurora Collective. If you guys are curious and want to get yourself a pair, I'll link her below. But today I wanted to cover the case of the Childers backpacker fire. This case was absolutely devastating and it took the lives of 15 young individuals, and to date it's one of Australia's worst mass killings. But to understand this event we really need to start from the beginning. So this all starts at the Childers Palace Backpackers Hostel. This hostel was located in the suburb of Childers, which is a tiny town located in Queensland, Australia. It's about 40 minutes from Bundaberg, which is a bigger regional town, and about 4 hours from Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland. This town is a small country town known for its historic buildings and surrounding sugarcane fields. In 2000, the Palace Backpackers Hostel was functioning and thriving, as many backpackers from all over the world would come to Childers to explore. Most of them would take up fruit picking jobs in the surrounding fields as ways to fund their holiday and earn a bit of extra money while exploring Australia. Now, Childers wasn't a huge town, but it had a really nice charm because it was just a classic small Australian town. And I think because of this very reason, a lot of people from outside of Australia, when they found out about this town, they just decided they really wanted to come here. It's one of those towns, it's like a classic Australian town, you know, it's one of those towns when you think Australia, you think of a town like this. There were also a lot of pubs in this town which both the locals and the backpackers would enjoy each night. There was the Federal Hotel, the Grand Hotel, and a few others, and it was just the thing you did when you came to Childers. Work in the day and go to the pub at night for a nice dinner. So on the night of the 22nd of June, it was a Thursday night. A lot of the backpackers had been out at the pub and various other places, but they decided to come back home. You know, it was getting later and they were tired. They had work the next day early, so they just wanted to have a nice full night's sleep to be able to get up early in the morning the next day for their jobs. So in the very early hours of Friday the 23rd of June 2000, pretty much every single one of the backpackers was asleep in their bed. It was pretty cold at this time too because it was winter in Australia, and all of the backpackers that were staying at the hostel were reasonably new as well. The hostel has been described as a bit of a rabbit's den with lots of twists and turns. It's actually 3 buildings constructed over different times, and the first of which being in 1902. It's interesting because the building that was constructed in 1902 was constructed because the previous building which was standing there had burned down in a fire. There was a really big tin corrugated roof over the first and second building though that sort of connected them together to make one big building, and they were 2-story buildings with a wooden walkway connecting them both on the second level. And these buildings were the ones with the accommodation in them. It was the administration, the kitchen, more accommodation. So yeah, these buildings were basically where everyone slept, and then that third building that I mentioned before was just bathrooms and like a gaming sort of room. And remember, this was 2000, so when I say gaming room, it would have been like old school. You know how gaming rooms used to always have a pool table and like an air hockey table? I wouldn't be surprised if there was that sort of stuff in there. So on the night of the incident, 2 backpackers, one by the name of Neil Griffith and the other one, I wasn't able to find his name, but they both needed to go to the bathroom, and so they crossed paths in the hallway. They had a quick chat and a laugh about the fact that they both needed to go to the bathroom, and then they went on their way. When Neil was on his way back to his room, he noticed a man downstairs sitting in the computer area. The internet wasn't so easily accessed back at this time in the early 2000s, and so a lot of hostels would have like a section where there was just computers, and so the guests could use those computers to reply to emails and do whatever else they wanted to do on those computers. And so Neil noticed a man sitting in this section, which was already kind of weird, but what made it even more worrying was the fact that the man was sitting next to a bin which was literally on fire, and on top of this a lounge pillow window was propped up on the bin, connecting the bin to a lounge which was next to it. It was almost like creating a bridge between the burning bin and the lounge. And of course Neil yelled out to the man. He said, "Hey, like, what do you think you're doing?" And the man said, oh my gosh, okay, I'll deal with it, and he took the bin outside, and Neil assumed he just took it out and put the fire out, and he didn't think too much of it. He was super tired. It was past midnight. He had work the next morning, and so Neil just went back to bed. Little did he know though that no more than 15 minutes later 3 more fires would be lit throughout the building. Because there were so many people staying at the hostel, upwards of 88, there is a lot of different accounts of what happened next. Some people said they woke up to what sounded like firecrackers popping. Other people said that they thought it sounded like someone had broken in downstairs and was smashing things. One person even turned on the lights when they heard all of this commotion, and as soon as they turned on the lights, they saw that there was black thick smoke filling up the rooms, and only a few seconds later the power was actually cut, and so it went pitch black. This building had no working fire alarms. There were no illuminated exit signs. It was, like I said, pitch black because the electricity had been cut, and this fire was burning fast. These backpackers were panicking. There was people screaming, trying to find a way out of this burning building. And what was even more sad is that a lot of the windows had like thick jail bars across the outside of the windows, and these had been installed previously as an attempt to make the building safer. They'd been installed so that people couldn't get into the building, but unfortunately what this meant when this fire was burning through the building is that people who were trying to escape couldn't escape out of these windows because of the bars. We're talking split-second decisions here, and some of these people just literally took a wrong turn. Instead of turning one way and getting to that walkway and being able to get out of the building, a lot of them went the other way, which meant that they ended up in this big room which was known as room 7, and that was one of those rooms that had those bars across the windows that they couldn't get out of. Some of the exit doors, which would have been safe exits to get out of the way of the fire, were also completely shut and blocked by beds, and this was because there was so many beds that were squashed into these rooms that the managers had decided it was a good idea to block these exit doors in an attempt to fit more beds in these buildings. Sadly, that night 15 people died in the fire. Some of them in their sleep, but most of them, like I said before, died while trying to get out of the building. Like I said, because of those bars that were over the windows, when police went in after the fire was put out to try and find all of the bodies, they found that a pile of bodies was piled up underneath that window, and I'll show the photo of the diagram here, and you can see how there's just so many bodies piled up, and I just can't even imagine what these people were thinking, knowing that they were trapped in this room and they couldn't get out, knowing that they were gonna die. It's just so sad to think about. This story went international after it happened. So many people all over the world were affected that night just because of how diverse the group of people that passed away in that fire was. There were 9 women and 6 men, and this photo here was painted by Josonia Palace after the fire, and it depicts all 15 of the individuals that passed away in the fire. And I wanted to take a moment here to read out the names of all of these people. So it was Sebastian Westerfield, who was 22, from Holland. There was Sarah Williams, who was 23, from England. Michael Lewis, who was 25, from England. Claire Webb, who was 24, from England. Natalie Morris, who was 18, from England. Gary Sutton, who was 24, from England. Melissa Smith, who was 26, from England. Atsuki Toyona, who was 31, from Japan. Stacey Slark, who was 23, from Australia. Julie O'Keefe, who was 24, from Ireland. Jolie van der Velden, who was 24, from Holland. Huey Kyung Lee, who was 23, from Korea. Adam Rowland, who was 19, from England. Kelly Slark, who was 22, from Australia. And Mole La Louis Kamal, who was 48, from the Kingdom of Morocco. So I'm guessing you're wondering who lit the fire and why, and it didn't take police long to know that the main suspect on this case was a man by the name of Robert Paul Long, who was 37 years old and on the run. Robert Paul Long was born in 1962 in a suburb called Corrimal, which is slightly north of Wollongong, New South Wales, and there isn't actually that much known about his life as a child growing up, but I do know that he was always seen as a bit of a recluse. He was a jealous type too, and he suffered from mental health issues such as depression. As a youth though, he was convicted of stealing women's clothing from their clothes lines, and I feel like that's sort of enough for us to be able to paint a picture of what he was like as a teenager. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've never thought about stealing women's clothes. Like, imagine getting convicted of that, having to stand in court and be like, yeah, like I stole Karen's undies. I don't know, I just feel like that would be really embarrassing. But anyways, by the mid-80s, Robert had met a lady by the name of Christine Campbell. Together they fell in love and they had a little girl. After their baby girl was born though, their relationship didn't end up working out. Robert was known to be quite abusive and manipulative, and he treated Christine really poorly. And so when their relationship ended, Christine moved on with another man, and she ended up having 2 more little babies with him. Robert of course didn't like this, and we see this so often in cases where the victim will move on and the abuser just can't deal with that, and so they'll decide to lash out. So in 1993, Robert forced his way into the home where Christine was living with her little babies and her new partner, and that was in Tugun on the Gold Coast. He then allegedly assaulted the man and abducted his 6-year-old daughter from her bed, and he was charged with attempted murder, child stealing, assault occasioning bodily harm, serious assault, and willful damage. In 1997, Christine had been staying at a caravan park with her 3 kids in Darwin, which is in the Northern Territory, when she realized her caravan was literally on fire. Thankfully, she was able to think quick and get her and her 3 kids out, but when she got out, she saw Paul Long sitting there watching that caravan burn up. Police were involved in the incident, and Robert was the main suspect, but he was actually never charged on this incident. After this though, Robert moved on. He didn't own a house or have any family that he was that close to, so he sort of drifted around from state to state, working on different farms and just doing odd little jobs that he could find to earn enough money to just be able to afford food. And he would usually stay in hostels too while he was doing this. He didn't make friends very easily at all, and in earlier 2000 he actually lost a job at one of the farms he was working at, which was near Childers, because he was making 2 of the other female workers feel really uncomfortable when he was around them. So yeah, Robert got dropped from that job, and at the time when this all happened, he was staying at the Childers Palace Hostel, and he had been staying there from about the 24th of March 2000 to the 14th of June, which is when he was actually kicked out because he hadn't paid around $200 in rent that he owed. Robert just wasn't very good with money. He had never been. He gambled a lot of it, and he was also an alcoholic, so I can imagine a lot of money went to paying for that addiction. There's actually reports though that the 2 hostel operators, Christian Atkinson and John Dobe, chased him down the street when they decided it was finally time to kick him out. I can just imagine this happening, like, and the neighbors pretending to wash their car or whatever to see the commotion. I don't know about you guys, but I've definitely done that before, where I've been like pretending to put away my washing or whatever when I can hear the neighbors having an argument across the road. I know I'm nosy, you guys, you don't need to come for me in the comments. But anyways, Robert had just been a general nuisance when he was staying at that hostel. He was a racist, and he had issues with multiple other people staying at the hostel. He always had to bring a drama to the scene, and he also was an attention seeker. He had actually previously threatened to burn down the hostel, and on top of this, he had written at least 2 suicide notes. I know one of them he left at a local pub, and I think the other one he may have left at the hostel for them to find. And don't get me wrong, you guys, suicide notes are a really serious deal, and I'm not making light of the fact that he had mental health issues, but he just had a track record of making things up. I mean, he told other lies too. He said that he had kids who had cancer. He said that he had cancer and he was dying. He told people that his ex-girlfriend had died in a car crash. There was just all sorts of stories that he was constantly making up while he was staying there. And so I think a lot of the other backpackers were just really quite relieved when he finally was kicked out of the hostel. So Robert actually kept a hold of his hostel key even when he got kicked out, and through ATM records we can see that for the next week he just stayed around the area, just lurking around, and I'm sure up to no good. There was one man in particular that Robert Long really didn't like. It was a young man by the name of Vishal Toma, and Robert had decided that he wanted to bash this guy up. So on the night of the fire on that Thursday night, Robert had ran into two other backpackers by the name of Martin Cockhill and Lisa Duffy right outside of the hostel. He had asked them if they could leave the back door of the hostel open so that he could bash this Vishal guy, to which they said no. I just get the vibe that Robert wasn't very smart. I don't know why you would ever ask someone you don't really know to leave a door open so you can bash someone else, because anyone with a good conscience would say no. But anyways, this angered Robert and he yelled back at them, "Oh well, I have a key anyways," which again, I don't know why he didn't just use the key in the first place. But anywho, I'm not Robert, so I can't tell you what was going through his mind on that night. But by this point, Robert was really angry. He was angry at the owners for kicking him out. He was angry at these two backpackers for how they had treated him, and he was angry at the Vishal Toma guy as well for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. And I guess all of it together was just enough to send him over the edge. So Robert Paul Long let himself in that night with that key that he had stolen, and he set the 3 fires. After this event, the community of Childers really came together to support the survivors of the fire. They were housed only a few hundred meters down the road at a community center called the ISIS Cultural Center, which isn't what it sounds like. It's just ISIS was a suburb which was right next to Childers. I guess they just used that name in the cultural center. The Childers residents though really came together by knitting blankets for these people, providing clothes, opening up their houses so that the survivors could use their showers and whatnot. And even Princess Anne, who was touring Australia at the time, because this was only a few months before the Sydney Olympics, which happened in obviously 2000, she decided to reroute her tour, and she actually went to Childers to chat to the survivors and just the first responders who had been working on that day. And there was also a big memorial set up to remember the 15 lives that had been lost that night. So while all of this was going on, Robert Paul Long was on the run. Police and pretty much everyone from Childers and around there was looking out for him though. Everyone knew what he looked like. Everyone knew who they were looking for, and it didn't take police long to close in on Robert and work out where he was. Like I said before, Robert had no money, so he had no way of getting food unless he stole it, and so that's what he'd been doing. He'd been stealing food off the back of people's trucks and whatnot. And on the 28th of June 2000, Robert was actually found. He was found in Howard, which is another small town about a 30-minute drive from Childers. He was in bushland, living in a shack basically, and at first only 2 police officers, Officer Damrow, who had a police dog with him by the name of Titan, and Officer Jones were the ones to the scene. Now I believe Officer Jones was a little bit behind Officer Damrow, so at first Officer Damrow was the only one at the scene. And when he confronted Robert, he said, "Stop where you are or I will release my dog on you." And Robert was not afraid. He came at Damrow, so Damrow released his dog Titan onto Robert, and Robert actually had a massive knife, so Titan the dog wasn't able to get a good enough grip on Robert, and he actually managed to stab Titan in his little doggy paw, which is so sad, but Titan was okay. But then Damo had to advance on Robert, and he did, and he actually got stabbed in the jaw. And Robert stabbed him so hard that the knife broke off and lodged itself in his jaw. So at this point, Jones is there and he can see that it is not going well, and so he decides to pull out his gun and start shooting at Robert, and he actually hit Robert right in his shoulder, which threw him to the ground, and he sort of stopped moving. And Robert, when he gets shot, he believes he's gonna die, so he actually says, "I'm dying anyway, I lit that fire." The thing was though, these men had no paper to write a confession on. When they had got the call that Robert was nearby, they weren't expecting it, and so they weren't fully prepared, but all they had was a $10 note. And as you can see in this photo here, Officer Jones wrote the confession on this $10 note, and then Robert of course was arrested, and after he recovered from his bullet wounds, he was sent to prison. And the police had a pretty strong case too, especially for arson, because of that confession. Now obviously Robert survived that bullet wound, and once he realized that he wasn't actually going to die, he ended up retracting his statement, or his confession I should say, which meant that the case had to go to trial. It only took the jury 2 days of deliberations to decide that Robert Paul Long was guilty on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of arson, and then he was sent to life in prison, which is only a 20-year non-parole period. And a lot of the families of the victims were really angry about the outcome of this case. He served the murder charges and the arson charges concurrently, which basically just means he served them at the same time. And so this man literally only did a 20-year non-parole period for 15 murders and trying to burn down a building of 88 people in it. The 2 counts for the murder charge were the 2 Australian girls who died in the fire. Their names were Kelly Slark and Stacey Slark. And the reason that the other murder charges weren't included is apparently to do with credibility of evidence collecting. Apparently it was just going to be too hard at the time to prove that the other victims were who they said they were, even through DNA testing. And the other reason apparently was because if Robert was going to get off on these charges, then the Crown could come in with the extra charges. Basically, even though the Crown believed they had a strong case, you are still needing to convince every single one of those people on that jury that he is guilty for him to be charged. Otherwise there can be a retrial, and I guess you need to be prepared for that to potentially happen, even though it is unlikely. And so that is one of the reasons that they kept some of that evidence in case they had to go to trial again, and then they could have fresh evidence to use against him to charge him again. But despite all of this, Robert was given the largest ever arson sentencing in the history of Queensland. But it's just such a shame that he served it concurrently with the murder charges, because if you think about it, this man murdered 15 people, and for the non-parole period to be only 20 years, that equals out to like what, not even 1.5 years for each murder. It's just crazy to me. Thankfully though, when Robert was able to apply for parole in 2020, which he did, it was rejected, meaning that he is still in prison, and he can apply again pretty soon actually, and hopefully it will just keep getting rejected. And I hope that if he was to try and get out of jail, they would bring in those other charges on the other murders that he wasn't charged for originally. I can't imagine that they wouldn't do that. In 2006 there was an inquest into the fires held by the state coroner of Brisbane. This was basically done to see if the hotel operators should also be held accountable for the fact that 15 people lost their lives in a fire in that building on that night. And this was done because that building wasn't up to fire safety standards. Like I said before, the fire alarms were not working, and there was multiple doors that had been blocked by beds and whatnot, which also resulted in people not being able to escape. But ultimately they were not charged with anything. But the document that I got this information from is a really interesting one, and I will definitely link it below if you guys want to have a read into the inquest. I would really recommend it because there's a lot of really interesting information in there. there. Robert Paul Long is still serving time in prison, and I truly hope he is in there for the rest of his life. As for the survivors, a lot of them still suffer from PTSD and survivor's guilt, and I think it's so sad that on top of that they still have to live their lives with the fear that potentially Robert may get out of prison while they're alive. In October of 2002, 2 years and 4 months after the devastating fire, and with countless members of the Childers community rallying together to support survivors and the families of the victims, the Palace Memorial Building was opened in a moving ceremony attended by 12 families who had relatives killed in the fire. The restored building encompassed a glass memorial wall, a portrait of the victims of the fire, the Childers Regional Art Gallery, and the Childers Visitor Information Center. Since opening in 2002, the Palace Memorial Building has received over 1 million visitors. It looks so beautiful too, and even though I've never personally been there, if any of you are ever in the area, and I know if I am ever in the area too, I will definitely make sure to give it a visit, and I would really recommend for you guys to as well. With that though, I come to the end of this case. Please feel free to comment below if you have any questions. I always feel like there is so much more information I could include in these videos, but I just don't, because I feel like sometimes they'll be too long. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that you are having a wonderful day wherever you are, and hopefully I will see you in my next one. Bye you guys.